Fear is usually described as poverty of the mind, a trembling state where imagination rules reason and the future feels heavier than the present. But Seneca saw something radically different. He believed fear, when faced deliberately, could become a form of inner wealth, not money, not status, not safety, but a kind of mental richness that no external force could steal. To understand how Seneca used fear to become mentally rich, we must first abandon the modern idea that fear is something to eliminate. For the Stoics, fear was not an enemy to destroy, but a teacher to confront. Seneca lived under constant threat. He was born into privilege, rose to immense power, and then found himself surrounded by danger at every level. Exile, political betrayal, public disgrace, and death were not abstract possibilities for him. They were daily realities. Unlike many philosophers who wrote from quiet distance, Seneca wrote while standing close to the edge. His life mirrors the same tension Marcus Aurelius would later describe when he wrote that you could leave life right now, and that truth should shape how you live, what you think, and what you do. Most people try to escape fear by distracting themselves. Seneca did the opposite. He walked directly into it. He practiced imagining loss, humiliation, illness, and death, not as catastrophes but as rehearsals. This was not pessimism, it was preparation. He believed the mind becomes poor when it is shocked by reality. It becomes rich when nothing unexpected can bankrupt it. Seneca understood that fear feeds on the unknown. When the future feels vague and undefined, the mind invents horrors. But once fear is named, examined, and stripped of exaggeration, it loses its power. Marcus Aurelius echoed this when he reminded himself that it is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. Fear is rarely about what actually happens. It is about what we imagine might happen. Seneca trained himself to ask one brutal question whenever fear arose. What is the worst that can actually occur? Not emotionally, not dramatically, but factually. Exile means living somewhere else. Poverty means eating simpler food. Illness means discomfort, not moral failure. Death means the end of sensation, not punishment. When fear was reduced to facts, it no longer controlled him. This is where mental wealth begins, when you are no longer ruled by emotional exaggeration. There is a quiet power in knowing you can endure what you fear. Seneca believed true wealth was not having much, but needing little. Fear often comes from attachment. Attachment to comfort, to reputation, to control, to certainty. The more tightly you cling to these, the poorer your inner life becomes. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. If your thoughts are full of fear, your inner world becomes narrow and fragile. Seneca wanted his inner world to be vast and unshakable. So he practiced voluntary discomfort. He would wear rough clothing, eat plain food, and live simply even when he could afford luxury. He did this not to punish himself, but to teach his mind that happiness does not depend on comfort. Fear loses its grip when the mind realizes it can survive without the things it clings to. Mental richness is born the moment you realize that losing external things does not mean losing yourself. Fear also exposes false values. Seneca noticed that people fear losing things they never truly owned. Status, praise, influence, even health are borrowed from fortune. They arrive without permission and leave without warning. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that fame is empty and that those who praise you today will forget you tomorrow. Seneca went further. He said that fearing the loss of borrowed things is like fearing the sunset. It is part of the natural order. By accepting impermanence, Seneca freed himself from fear's most corrosive effect, anxiety about the future. The future does not exist yet, but fear lives there constantly. Seneca insisted on bringing the mind back to the present moment. Right now, you are alive. Right now, you can act with reason and virtue. Right now is enough. Everything else is imagination pretending to be reality. Fear also sharpens awareness when used correctly. Seneca did not deny danger. He acknowledged it clearly. But instead of panicking, he asked what fear could teach him. Fear revealed where he was attached, where he was dishonest with himself, where he relied too heavily on external approval. In this way, fear became a diagnostic tool. a mirror that showed him where his philosophy was weak and needed strengthening. Marcus Aurelius treated adversity the same way. He believed obstacles were fuel for the mind, not barriers to peace. What stands in the way becomes the way. Seneca believed fear, when faced directly, becomes a form of discipline. It trains the mind to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when emotions rise, and to choose virtue even when survival instincts scream otherwise. Mental richness is not comfort, it is confidence in one's capacity to endure. Seneca's fear did not disappear, it transformed. It became respect for reality instead of terror of it. He understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act. According to reason, despite it, most people are mentally poor because they outsource their peace to conditions they cannot control. Seneca refused to do this. He invested his inner wealth in discipline, clarity, and acceptance. Fear stopped being a threat and became a reminder of what truly mattered, not survival at any cost, but integrity at any cost. This is why Seneca could face exile without bitterness, danger without desperation, and death without regret. He had already met these fears in his mind and discovered they were survivable. The man who has faced fear in advance is never truly poor. He carries his wealth within him, untouchable, silent, and strong. Fear does not disappear once you understand it. Seneca knew this, and this is where his philosophy becomes sharper and more demanding. Understanding fear intellectually is easy. Living with it daily without surrendering your peace is the real work. Seneca trained his mind the same way Marcus Aurelius trained his, through constant inner dialogue. Not comforting lies, but honest reminders of what truly has power over you and what does not. Seneca noticed that most fear comes from anticipation rather than experience. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. This single observation became one of his greatest sources of mental wealth. When the mind learns to separate what is happening now from what might happen later, fear loses its urgency. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the present moment is all that ever belongs to us. Seneca lived this truth by refusing to let tomorrow steal today's clarity. He practiced confronting fear before it arrived. When he feared poverty, he lived simply for days. When he feared exile, he imagined himself walking unfamiliar streets with dignity. When he feared death, he reflected on the natural order of things, not with drama, but with calm acceptance. Fear thrives when it feels unfamiliar. Seneca made it familiar. Once fear becomes familiar, it becomes manageable. This is where mental richness deepens. A rich mind is not surprised by hardship, it is prepared for it. Seneca believed that preparation is a form of freedom. The person who has rehearsed adversity is no longer enslaved by chance. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should greet whatever comes as something you were waiting for. This was not passive resignation, it was active readiness. Fear also tests values. Seneca realized that fear often forces people to betray their principles. When safety becomes the highest goal, virtue becomes negotiable. Seneca refused this trade. He believed that losing peace is worse than losing life, because a life without integrity is already broken. Marcus Aurelius shared this conviction. He warned himself never to do anything that would make him ashamed in his own eyes. This is why Seneca could remain composed under political threat. He understood that external power could command his body, but not his judgment. Fear tries to convince you that survival is everything. Seneca believed character was everything. This belief made him mentally rich even when his circumstances were fragile. Seneca also understood that fear shrinks the soul. When you live in fear, your world becomes small. You avoid risk, silence truth, and settle for comfort. A rich mind expands instead of contracts. Seneca expanded his mind by reminding himself that discomfort is not danger and uncertainty is not destruction. Marcus Aurelius echoed this when he wrote that the universe is change and life is opinion. Change does not harm you unless your judgment makes it harmful. Another way Seneca transformed fear was by reducing desire. Desire and fear are siblings. You fear losing what you desire too much. Seneca practiced wanting less so that fear would have nothing to threaten. This is mental wealth in its purest form. When your happiness depends on very little, fortune has very little leverage over you. He warned that luxury trains fear. The more comforts you depend on, the more terrified you become of losing them. A simple life, on the other hand, trains resilience. Seneca did not reject wealth itself. He rejected dependence on it. Marcus Aurelius lived in a palace, yet reminded himself daily that he could live just as well without it. This is the Stoic paradox. Possess things, but never let them possess you. Fear also distorts time. It pulls the mind into the future and traps it there. Seneca constantly returned himself to now. Right now you are breathing. Right now your reason is intact. Right now nothing essential is missing. When fear pulls you forward, grounding yourself in the present becomes an act of resistance. Marcus Aurelius used the same technique. He narrowed his attention to what was immediately in front of him and refused to add unnecessary suffering. Seneca believed that fear reveals who you truly are, not in comfort but under pressure. Fear strips away illusion and exposes attachment. This is why he did not resent fear. He used it as a test. Where am I weak? Where do I rely too much on approval? Where do I confuse convenience with necessity? Each answer made his philosophy stronger. Mental richness grows when you stop asking how to avoid fear and start asking how to use it. Seneca used fear to sharpen judgment, strengthen discipline, and clarify values. He did not try to feel fearless. He tried to feel unshakable. There is a difference. Fearlessness depends on conditions. Unshakability depends on character. Marcus Aurelius believed that the mind becomes invincible when it accepts whatever happens as necessary and chooses virtue regardless. Seneca lived this belief by treating fear as training. Each fearful thought an opportunity to practice reason. Each anxious moment became a reminder to return to what he could control. By doing this repeatedly, fear lost its authority. It could appear, but it could not command. It could warn, but it could not rule. This is the state of mental wealth Seneca aimed for, not the absence of fear, but sovereignty over it. Most people remain mentally poor because they let fear dictate their choices. Seneca became mentally rich because he made fear obey reason. He understood that the mind is either governed by impulse or by principle. Fear belongs to impulse. Wisdom belongs to principle. And when wisdom rules, fear becomes just another signal, not a sentence. It speaks, but it does not decide. At a certain point, Seneca realized something unsettling. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as caution that slowly turns into paralysis. This is more dangerous because it feels reasonable. You tell yourself you are being careful, but in truth you are being controlled. Seneca warned that a life ruled by fear will always look sensible from the outside and empty from the inside. He observed that many people never truly live because they are always preparing to live. They delay courage, honesty, and purpose until conditions feel safe. Marcus Aurelius confronted the same illusion when he reminded himself not to act as if he had 10,000 years to live. Fear tricks the mind into postponement. Seneca broke this spell by treating time as precious and uncertain. Fear also disguises itself as the desire for certainty. Seneca saw this clearly. The mind wants guarantees before it commits, but life offers none. Waiting for certainty is another form of fear. Marcus Aurelius accepted uncertainty as part of nature itself. He trained himself to act well without knowing outcomes. Seneca did the same. He believed that peace comes not from controlling results, but from controlling intention. This is where mental richness becomes visible in action. A rich mind does not freeze when outcomes are unclear. It moves forward guided by principle. Seneca believed that virtue is the only safe investment because it cannot be taken away by chance. Everything else is temporary. Reputation fades, power shifts, health declines. But how you choose to act remains yours until the end. Fear often exaggerates loss. Seneca asked what exactly is lost when fortune turns. Comfort, yes. Familiarity, yes. But character remains untouched unless you surrender it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that external events cannot touch the soul unless the soul consents. This idea turned fear into something manageable. If fear could not harm his core, then it did not deserve obedience. Seneca also noticed that fear weakens community. Fear isolates. People become guarded, suspicious, and self-focused. A mind rich in Stoic discipline remains open and generous even under threat. Seneca believed that withdrawing from others out of fear impoverishes the soul. Marcus Aurelius wrote that humans are made for cooperation. Fear pulls us apart. Reason brings us back together. This is why Seneca emphasized inner independence. When your sense of worth depends on others' approval, fear multiplies. You fear rejection, criticism, and misunderstanding. Seneca trained himself to be his own witness. He cared more about being at peace with himself than being praised by the crowd. Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily, reminding himself that applause is fleeting and often meaningless. Fear also distorts self-perception. It makes you believe you are weaker than you are. Seneca rejected this lie. He constantly reminded himself of human endurance. People survive exile, poverty, illness, and grief every day. Not because they are extraordinary, but because they are human. Fear underestimates your capacity. Philosophy corrects this distortion. Mental wealth grows when you trust your ability to endure rather than your ability to avoid. Seneca trusted endurance. He believed that the mind becomes powerful not by escaping difficulty, but by standing upright within it. Marcus Aurelius captured this when he wrote that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Seneca also warned against fearing public opinion. This fear is subtle but destructive. It makes people betray their own judgment to remain acceptable. Seneca believed that fearing shame is worse than experiencing it. Shame fades. Self-betrayal lingers. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that it is better to do what is right than what is popular. Fear of death was the final fear Seneca faced honestly. He did not treat death as an enemy. He treated it as a boundary that gives life meaning. Without death, urgency disappears. Fear of death makes people cling to life desperately. Acceptance of death makes people live deliberately. Seneca believed that preparing for death was actually preparing for freedom. He wrote that the one who has learned to die has unlearned how to be a slave. This was not morbid, it was liberating. When death no longer terrifies you, threats lose their power. Marcus Aurelius lived with this awareness constantly. He reminded himself that death is natural and that fearing it is irrational. Fear becomes most dangerous when it convinces you to abandon the present for an imagined future. Seneca refused this. He anchored himself in what was real, immediate, and within reach. Act with virtue now. Speak truth now. Accept what is given now. This discipline created a sense of inner abundance that no external loss could touch. Mental richness is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is felt as steadiness when others panic, clarity when others rush, and dignity when others compromise. Seneca cultivated this richness patiently, through daily confrontation with fear rather than denial of it. Fear did not disappear from his life, but it stopped being his master. It became a signal, a test, and occasionally a reminder of mortality, nothing more. And when fear is reduced to this, it loses its ability to rule you. Seneca eventually reached a point where fear could no longer surprise him. This did not mean that life became easy, it meant that life became honest. He stopped asking how to remain safe and started asking how to remain aligned with reason. This shift is subtle but transformative. Safety is fragile, alignment is stable. Marcus Aurelius lived by the same principle, reminding himself that tranquility comes from doing what is right, not from avoiding what is hard. Seneca understood that fear grows strongest when the mind argues with reality. When you resist what has already happened or panic about what has not yet arrived, fear multiplies. Acceptance does not mean approval, it means clarity. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. He trained himself to say, "This is what the world has given me, now what is the most reasonable response?" Fear also feeds on identity. Seneca noticed that people fear losing roles more than losing themselves. Titles, positions, and reputations become masks we confuse for our true nature. When those masks are threatened, fear erupts. Seneca stripped his identity down to one thing only, his capacity to reason and act with virtue. Everything else was decoration. Marcus Aurelius did the same. Emperor or not, he reminded himself that he was first a rational being. This reduction created mental wealth. When your identity is simple, it is difficult to threaten. Fear thrives in complexity. It thrives when the self is spread across possessions, opinions, and expectat. Ions. Seneca gathered himself inward. The fewer things he needed to protect, the freer he became. Seneca also believed that fear thrives in noise. Constant stimulation, opinion, and distraction weaken judgment. A noisy mind is an anxious mind. He valued solitude not as escape, but as training. Silence allowed fear to surface without distortion. Instead of drowning it out, he examined it calmly. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in private for the same reason, not to perform wisdom, but to practice it. Another way Seneca used fear was by measuring it against nature. He asked whether what he feared was unnatural or simply uncomfortable. Nature includes change, loss, aging, and death. Fearing these is like fearing gravity. Resistance creates suffering. Acceptance restores balance. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that whatever happens is part of the whole, and the whole is rational. Fear often narrows moral vision. When afraid, people justify behavior they would otherwise condemn. Seneca warned against this corruption. He believed fear tests ethics. Will you remain just when injustice benefits you? Will you remain honest when lying feels safer? Marcus Aurelius demanded this standard of himself relentlessly. He refused to let fear excuse moral compromise. Seneca's mental richness was visible in his composure, not coldness but steadiness. He could engage deeply with life without clinging to outcomes. Fear tries to control the future. Wisdom stays rooted in the present. This grounding allowed Seneca to advise others calmly, even while facing his own dangers. When Nero ordered Seneca's death, fear had no leverage left. Seneca had already accepted this possibility years earlier. Death did not arrive as a shock, it arrived as a confirmation of his philosophy. Marcus Aurelius understood this too. He wrote that death smiles at us all, and all we can do is S&M. I'll back. This moment reveals the ultimate form of mental wealth, to meet the end without bitterness, panic, or regret. Seneca did not cling to life or curse fate. He focused on meeting his final moments with dignity. Fear could not steal that from him. Mental poverty panics at the edge. Mental wealth remains calm. Seneca's calm was not indifference, it was alignment with reality. He had lived consistently with his beliefs, and so there was nothing left to defend. Fear becomes powerless when there is nothing it can threaten that truly matters. Seneca had already surrendered comfort, reputation, and control. What remained was character, and character cannot be taken by force. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if you live in harmony with nature, you will never be poor. Seneca proved this through his relationship with fear. He used it as training rather than torment. He allowed it to refine his priorities rather than dominate his decisions. This is why Seneca was mentally rich even in his final hours. He possessed something rare, inner freedom, a mind that could not be coerced by terror or temptation. And this freedom did not come from avoiding fear. It came from facing it daily, honestly, and without illusion. Seneca's final insight about fear was perhaps the most difficult to accept. Fear never fully disappears because it is woven into human awareness. The mistake is believing that peace requires its absence. Seneca discovered that peace comes from relationship, not elimination. When fear is understood, acknowledged, and placed under reason, it loses its tyranny. Marcus Aurelius practiced the same discipline, never demanding emotional perfection from himself, only moral clarity. Seneca warned that people exhaust themselves trying to feel safe instead of trying to be wise. Safety depends on luck. Wisdom depends on choice. This distinction changes everything. When fear ices, the question is no longer how do I stop this feeling, but how do I respond to it? This response is where freedom lives. Fear may knock, but reason decides whether to open the door. He also saw that fear intensifies when people seek control over what is uncontrollable. Time, other people, outcomes, and fortune resist control. Fighting this reality drains the mind. Acceptance restores strength. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that you cannot stop events from happening, but you can stop them from harming you internally. Seneca lived this truth by surrendering the illusion of control and strengthening judgment instead. Fear also teaches humility. It reminds us of limits. Seneca did not resent this reminder. He believed humility aligns the mind with nature. Arrogance invites fear because it depends on permanence. Humility accepts change and adapts. A humble mind bends instead of breaks. This flexibility is another form of mental wealth. Seneca observed that fear is often inherited rather than chosen. Society teaches people what to fear. Poverty, obscurity, aging, and death are framed as failures rather than natural experiences. Seneca questioned these assumptions. Who decided these were evils? Who benefits from this fear? Marcus Aurelius asked similar questions, reminding himself that many fears are borrowed opinions rather than personal truths. By questioning fear's source, Seneca weakened it. Not every fear deserves respect. Some fears are social habits disguised as wisdom. Mental richness grows when you choose your values consciously instead of absorbing them passively. Fear also reveals impatience. People fear pain because they assume it will last forever. Seneca corrected this illusion. No emotion is permanent. Pain rises and falls like everything else. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that even intense suffering passes. Remembering this gives the mind spa. To breathe. Another way Seneca used fear was by practicing gratitude. This may seem contradictory, but it is not. Gratitude anchors the mind in what is present and sufficient. Fear drags the mind toward what might be lost. Gratitude and fear cannot dominate the mind at the same time. Seneca deliberately cultivated appreciation for simple things to counterbalance anxiety. He believed that the mind becomes wealthy when it recognizes abundance in the present rather than security in the future. Marcus Aurelius practiced the same awareness, reminding himself of how much he already possessed without effort. Existence itself is a gift. Fear forgets this. Philosophy remembers it. Seneca also warned against dramatizing suffering. Fear exaggerates. It turns discomfort into catastrophe. Seneca trained himself to describe experiences plainly. Pain is pain, loss is loss. They do not require added commentary. Marcus Aurelius used similar restraint, refusing to label events as terrible or unbearable. This neutral language protects the mind from unnecessary suffering. As Seneca aged, fear gradually lost its urgency, not because life became predictable, but because his mind became steady. He no longer needed reassurance. He trusted his capacity to respond wisely. This trust is the foundation of mental richness. Confidence not in outcomes, but in character. By the end of his life, Seneca had transformed fear from a force that threatened him into a tool that refined him. Fear sharpened his awareness, clarified his priorities, and disciplined his desires. It showed him where attachment weakened him and where reason strengthened him. Marcus Aurelius summarized this Stoic achievement simply. If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Seneca lived this understanding until the end. Mental wealth is not loud. It owes not boast. It reveals itself quietly in how a person meets uncertainty, loss, and the unknown. Seneca met them with composure, not because he was fearless, but because he was prepared. Fear no longer promised him disaster. It only reminded him to return to reason. This is how Seneca used fear to become mentally rich, not by conquering it, but by mastering himself. Seneca reached a stage where fear stopped feeling urgent and started feeling informative. This is a turning point most people never reach. Fear usually feels like an alarm demanding immediate reaction. Seneca trained himself to treat it as data instead. When fear appeared, he did not rush to silence it or obey it. He paused and asked what belief inside him had been disturbed. Marcus Aurelius practiced the same pause, reminding himself that the mind has the power to step back from impressions before accepting them. Seneca noticed that fear always arrives with a story about what might happen, what it would mean, and how unbearable it would be. These stories feel convincing because they speak in emotion rather than reason. Seneca broke their spell by separating facts from interpretation. What is actually happening? What am I adding to it? This simple separation dissolved much of fear's intensity. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if you remove the judgment, you remove the suffering. Seneca lived this truth repeatedly. Fear also revealed how people confuse pain with harm. Seneca made a sharp distinction here. Pain affects the body, harm affects character. Only one of these truly matters. Once this distinction is clear, fear loses its authority. You may suffer discomfort, loss, or illness, but none of these can force you to abandon virtue unless you allow them to. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that nothing external can damage the soul. Seneca also observed that fear grows when the mind feels unprepared. Preparation does not mean controlling outcomes, it means strengthening response. He prepared by rehearsing calm, dignity, and reason. When fear arrived, it met a trained mind instead of a panicked one. This training was daily and quiet, not dramatic courage, but consistent discipline. Marcus Aurelius called this the art of ruling the inner citadel. Another insight Seneca developed was that fear often comes from self-importance, the belief that what happens to you is uniquely terrible. Seneca dissolved this by remembering the shared human condition. Millions have faced exile, illness, loss, and death before. You are not being singled out by fate. This perspective shrinks fear by restoring proportion. Marcus Aurelius used the same cosmic view, placing his own troubles against the vastness of time and nature. Seneca also warned that fear loves urgency. It demands immediate decisions and rushed reactions. Wisdom slows the moment down. When you slow down, fear weakens. The mind regains choice. Seneca trained himself never to decide while emotionally shaken. He believed that time is an ally of reason. Marcus Aurelius practiced delaying judgment until the mind was clear. Fear also tempts people to compromise truth, to exaggerate, conceal, or distort reality for protection. Seneca refused this. He believed honesty stabilizes the mind. Lies multiply fear because they require constant defense. Truth simplifies life. A simple life is a calmer life. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to speak plainly and act straightforwardly, even when it was inconvenient. As Seneca practiced these disciplines, fear began to change shape. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a reminder to return to first principles. What is in my control? What is not? What does reason demand here? Each time he answered these questions, his confidence deepened. Not confidence in fortune, but confidence in judgment. Mental richness shows itself here, when fear no longer dictates speed, direction, or values. When it is heard but not obeyed. Seneca reached a state where fear could no longer rush him, blind him, or corrupt him. It could only signal that attention was needed. Marcus Aurelius described this state as inner stability, a mind that remains upright whether events push or pull. Seneca achieved it by refusing to treat fear as an emergency and choosing instead to treat it as instruction. This is the quiet mastery at the heart of Stoicism. Fear does not disappear, it is absorbed into reason. Seneca began to see fear as a mirror that never lies. It does not invent weakness, it reveals it. Whenever fear appeared, it pointed directly to something inside him that was still attached, still dependent, still untrained. Instead of feeling ashamed of this exposure, Seneca welcomed it. Marcus Aurelius treated his own inner disturbances the same way, as signals showing where philosophy had not yet fully settled into character. Fear often exposed dependence on comfort. Seneca noticed how easily the mind panics when it imagines losing ease and convenience. A softer life produces a more fragile mind. This is why he deliberately returned to simplicity again and again. By choosing discomfort voluntarily, he weakened fear's ability to threaten him. Marcus Aurelius practiced this same mental stripping, reminding himself how little the body truly needs. Another attachment fear revealed was reputation. Seneca understood how deeply people fear judgment, ridicule, and misunderstanding. This fear quietly controls behavior. It bends speech, weakens conviction, and erodes integrity. Seneca trained himself to value his own conscience above public opinion. Marcus Aurelius echoed this discipline when he warned himself not to become Caesarized by the crowd. Fear also illum, innated attachment to control. The desire to manage outcomes, reactions, and futures creates constant anxiety. Seneca saw that this attachment is irrational because control was never truly ours. Nature does not negotiate. Events unfold according to laws larger than individual desire. Accepting this truth did not make him passive, it made him focused. He invested energy where it mattered, in judgment and action, not in outcomes. As these attachments loosened, fear lost its leverage. It had nothing left to threaten. Seneca compared this to a fire running out of fuel. The flame may still exist, but it cannot spread. This is the state Marcus Aurelius described when he wrote about the mind becoming impregnable, not because nothing happens, but because nothing overwhelms. Seneca also discovered that fear shrinks when life has purpose. Aimless minds are anxious minds. When you do not know what you are living for, every threat feels catastrophic. Seneca anchored his life in philosophy and service. This gave fear a boundary. Even if circumstances collapsed, his purpose remained intact. Marcus Aurelius lived under the same rule, tying his identity to duty rather than comfort. Fear also fades when attention is disciplined. A wandering mind amplifies anxiety. Seneca practiced directing his attention deliberately, not chasing every thought, not indulging every worry. He chose what deserved mental energy. Marcus Aurelius described this as keeping the ruling faculty clean. A clean mind is harder to frighten. Another transformation occurred when Seneca stopped resisting vulnerability. Fear often comes from pretending to be invulnerable. Seneca accepted human fragility fully. Illness, aging, and death were no longer insults to his pride. They were facts of nature. Accepting vulnerability removed the shock factor from fear. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that he was a part of nature, not an exception to it. Seneca also warned against confusing fear with wisdom. Not every hesitation is insight. Sometimes fear disguises itself as prudence. Seneca learned to test this by asking whether avoidance was protecting virtue or merely protecting comfort. Marcus Aurelius used the same test. If the action was right, fear was irrelevant. Mental richness appears clearly at this stage. Fear no longer dictates what is avoided. Reason decides what is worth doing. This shift is subtle but powerful. Life expands when fear stops setting limits. By using fear as a mirror rather than an enemy, Seneca refined his character continuously. Each fear exposed another attachment. Each attachment released made the mind lighter, freer, and stronger. Marcus Aurelius described this as living in agreement with oneself. Seneca achieved it by listening to fear without obeying it. This is how fear stops being a burden and becomes a guide. By the time Seneca reached the later years of his life, fear had changed its role completely. It no longer appeared as something to wrestle with. It appeared as a reminder of impermanence. This reminder did not weaken him. It sharpened him. Marcus Aurelius lived with the same awareness, keeping death close in thought so that life would not be wasted in distraction or delay. Seneca understood that when a person forgets death, fear becomes chaotic. When death is accepted, fear becomes orderly. Everything finds its proper scale. Small inconveniences lose importance. Serious matters gain clarity. This perspective gave Seneca a kind of calm urgency. He did not rush, but he did not postpone what mattered. Marcus Aurelius practiced this same balance, acting deliberately without illusion of permanence. Fear also lost its sting because Seneca stopped arguing with fate. He saw fate not as cruelty but as structure. Events unfold according to causes larger than individual will. Fighting this reality creates suffering. Working with it creates peace. Marcus Aurelius described this as loving whatever happens, because it happens according to nature. Seneca reached this understanding through long reflection and personal loss. Another shift occurred when Seneca stopped measuring life by length and began measuring it by depth. Fear of death shrinks when life is lived fully. Regret fuels fear. Fulfillment dissolves it. Seneca lived with intention, knowing that an unfinished life is more frightening than a short one. Marcus Aurelius echoed this when he reminded himself that it is not death a man should fear, but never beginning to live. Fear also softened as Seneca's trust in reason matured. He no longer needed constant reassurance. He had seen himself endure difficulty and remain intact. This memory built quiet confidence, not arrogance, but assurance. Marcus Aurelius developed the same confidence by reminding himself of past endurance. You have survived before. You can survive again. Seneca also came to see fear as a sign of misalignment rather than danger. When fear returned strongly, it meant some attachment had reappeared. Some desire had grown too large. Instead of panicking, he adjusted, reduced desire, simplified expectations, returned to essentials. This ongoing correction kept fear from accumulating into anxiety. He also understood that fear diminishes when service replaces self-obsession. A mind turned inward excessively magnifies its own problems. Seneca believed that contributing to others through counsel, teaching, or example diluted fear. Marcus Aurelius believed the same, seeing service as a natural duty of rational beings. Fear eventually lost its personal narrative. It stopped being about what would happen to Seneca. It became a neutral signal about the state of his mind. This depersonalization weakened it further. Fear thrives on the story of me. Philosophy dissolves that story into something larger. When Seneca faced his final command, fear did not argue. It had nothing left to say. His life had been consistent. His values were clear. His mind was prepared. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a good life equips you for a good death. Seneca embodied this truth. Mental richness at this stage is serenity, not excitement, not comfort, serenity, a steady acceptance of whatever remains. Fear cannot disturb this state because there is nothing left to protect. Seneca's journey shows that fear does not vanish suddenly. It fades as attachments loosen, clarity strengthens, and purpose deepens. Each step reduces fear's influence until it becomes almost ceremonial, a reminder of mortality, nothing more. Marcus Aurelius believed that the best revenge against fear is living well. Seneca lived well by refusing to let fear dictate his pace, his values, or his character. This is why, in the end, fear did not make Seneca smaller. It made him precise, deliberate, and free. In the final stage of Seneca's life, fear had completely lost its authority, not because circumstances became gentle, but because his inner posture was settled. He no longer asked life to be kind, he asked himself to be ready. This is the deepest Stoic victory. Marcus Aurelius described it as meeting events with a soul prepared, not surprised. Seneca arrived at this state through years of disciplined thought and honest self-examination. By now, fear had become almost ceremonial. It appeared briefly, reminded him of mortality, and passed. It no longer disrupted his sleep or clouded his judgment. This calm was not numbness, it was clarity. Seneca understood that when you have aligned your life with reason, fear has nowhere to land. It cannot threaten reputation if reputation no longer defines you. It can. Threaten comfort if comfort is not your source of peace. It cannot threaten life if death has already been accepted. Seneca's final lesson is subtle but powerful. Fear cannot be defeated by force. It dissolves only when the mind becomes whole. Fragmented minds are fearful minds. When desires pull in different directions, when values conflict, fear thrives in the chaos. Seneca unified his life around one principle: live according to reason and nature. Marcus Aurelius did the same, reminding himself that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Fear also disappeared because Seneca stopped narrating his life as a personal drama. He saw himself as part of a larger order, a brief expression of nature, here for a time, then gone. When the self is no longer exaggerated, fear shrinks proportionally. Marcus Aurelius constantly reduced himself in this way, placing his own life against the vastness of time and the universe. In this final clarity, Seneca no longer feared losing anything because he no longer believed he owned anything. Life was alone. Breath was borrowed. Time was temporary. You do not fear returning what was never yours to keep. This understanding transformed death from a threat into a completion. Marcus Aurelius echoed this when he wrote that what returns to nature is not lost. Mental richness reveals itself here more clearly than anywhere else. It is the ability to stand calmly at the edge of uncertainty without demanding guarantees, to act rightly without needing reward, to accept endings without resentment. Seneca reached this state not by escaping fear, but by walking with it until it taught him everything it could. Fear had trained his courage, it had refined his values, it had stripped away illusion, and once its work was done, it became unnecessary. Like a teacher whose lessons have been learned, it stepped aside. This is why Seneca's philosophy still speaks across centuries. Not because it promises comfort, but because it promises strength. Not because it removes fear, but because it shows how to live without being ruled by it. Marcus Aurelius believed that the soul becomes unconquerable when it chooses virtue over fear. Seneca proved this with his life. In the end, Seneca was not remembered for avoiding danger, but for meeting it with dignity. He was not mentally rich because he had power or influence. He was mentally rich because nothing external could make him betray himself. This is the Stoic inheritance. Fear will come, loss will come, death will come, but none of these need to own you. When reason governs the mind, fear becomes quiet.